Okay, in this video, we're going to talk about configuration UIs, what they're for, and then we're going to walk through some of the capabilities and things you need to know about configuration UIs. So first off, what is a config UI? So a config UI is a presentation layer that is used with MDF objects. The most prominent of which are position and payment information. And what these allow you to do is kind of realign how things look on the screen as compared with the overall backend object. So if you're watching this video, you're probably already familiar with configuration of object definitions for MDF objects, where that's where we go in and we make, we add fields, we can make fields editable, we can make them required, things like that. And so I definitely recommend that if you need to do any of those things, you do it directly on configuration object definition. So if I need to add a field, obviously I have to do it there. Then if I need to make a field editable or required, I do it on the configure object definitions. And then that change in also floats up and is available to the config UI. But then the config UI takes a step further, and as you'll see, it allows us to kind of realign and present the data in a little bit more attractive manner, as well as provide some visualization rules so that we can do things like make fields hidden or required or editable, depending on what else has taken place inside the same screen. So there's some dynamic things you can do there. So we're going to go through a couple of examples, one on the position side, one on the payment information sides, just so that you can see all of the capabilities of config UI. Okay, so I'm going to start at the home page just so that you can get your bearings. So I'm going to go in now, and I am going to go to Config UI, Manage Configuration UI, and you can see that brings me to this screen, and then I can see what all configuration UIs are already in the system. So you're going to be delivered with configuration UI for the positions, and then for payment information, you can go off to import and export data, go and download from the Success Store the latest version of the payment information config UI. So that's where you can go and make sure that you've got a starting point. So you're not starting these things from scratch. Saves you a lot of time. So I'm going to go in now, and we're going to start with position. So I'm going to start with position UI 3. And you'll see here, this is what's delivered by SuccessFactors. You can see it's got all of the layout and you can see that it's kind of broken down into two sections. And this is what's valuable about this. You can see that we have position and job details, and then organization down in a separate section. So what that allows us to do is things that are just kind of job related, you can put in this top section, and then the bottom section you can have the organization section, so you can have all of those details kind of separated. So as I mentioned earlier, you'll notice here we have a lot of fields here, many of which I've actually hidden via the config UI, on configure object definitions. So if you go into configure object definitions for position, I've gone through and, for example, I've made regular, temporary, I've made that field not visible. So in other words, it's not visible over there. So guess what? When you pull this up, even though if the screen here shows that field, it's still not going to show up. So it's still going to, if something is editable, if something is not visible on the configure object definitions, the config UI will not override that. So if you've got it, but if you vice versa, if I have something that is editable on the configure object definitions, the config UI can make it invisible. So you can hide things on this view. But again, I don't recommend that. I say let's use drive the visibility off configure object definition, so it's really clear that we're managing all of that in one place on configure object definitions. So instead, what we have to do here on the config UI is this is where we're going to group things into sections, as well as what I'm going to show you now, which is, let's say that I add a field on the configure object definitions, which I have done for positions. In our example, I'm going to have I'm adding employment type onto my object definition. I have already done that, and rather than going over and showing you what that looks like, it's the name of it is cust_employment type. So I'm going to add that field in here now. So you can see here I pushed add field, and you'll see that that field showed up here down at the bottom. And then I'm just going to roll this up here so that it's in our section. There's a little bit of monkeying around sometimes we have to do. So you can see here the FTE, I moved that up just so that the input down here is the last thing in this section. So now what I can do here is I click on that pencil here, and it gets me, you can see the name shows up here, show label, yes, no, required, yes, no, editable, visible. Again, I don't like using these values here. I'd rather maintain that on configure object definitions so that all of that data is there as well. Label override, again, if I wanted to have a separate label here than what's in configure object definitions, I could do that, but I don't like doing that. We're going to get into change UI rules when we look at payment information. I'm not going to get into that right now, but what I'm going to do instead, though, is I'm going to go to value type resolver, and now it's going to present me with all of the fields from the position, and I'll select the field that I'm wanting to add, and that field, scroll down here to the bottom, you can see employment type. So that's the field that I had added. This is a custom field. It's not part of the standard definition for position, but I added this in as a custom field. So I'm going to click on that, employment type. I click OK. You'll see here that nothing's changed, and it won't change. I don't see the employment type label here. It still says input, but the next time I come in, after I save this and I come back, this label is automatically going to default into whatever it is on the on the object definition. So now that I've done that, I press save. All right, so now I've created, oh shoot, you know what I didn't do? I actually updated the delivered one from SuccessFactors, and that's not what we want to do. Instead, what you want to do is you want to come in. If you're starting from, a SuccessFactors version, then what I like to do is change the ID. You can do it with a kind of a customer identifier. Like I sometimes use CUST underscore and then the object, or I can also say, like, the first an identifier for that individual customer, whatever. You just want it to be unique. And so now I'm going to change this, and I have to make a small update. This one's not in use, so I am going to just put in a label override. I had to do that so that I get the save button. So again, what I should have done when I initially came in here is, once I pulled up position UI3, I should have immediately changed this ID to cust position UI3, but I didn't. Now I'm going to press save, and now I have created my custom version of the config UI. So now I need to assign that to the position. So I will go in here, and I will go back to configure UI configure object definitions. Go to object definition, position. I can't type. All right, and you'll see here down at the bottom that I have cust employment type as one of, this was the field that I was just adding. Now I want to, but I need to change this default screen to my new custom config UI. And so I'll go to cust position UI. So that's it. I've created the default screen. Now, if I go back in, I'm going to go to the, let's see, visibility. All right. Now, if we go in and look at the position UI, so I'm going to go into, and I'm just going to pull up one just so that you can see. Down here at the bottom, I have added the employment type field. So again, automatically pops in there. All right, so that's one version, or that's one example. Now I'm going to show you the other config UI that people tend to work with a lot, and that is the payment information. So payment information is actually compiled of a couple of different objects behind the scenes, and the config UI kind of puts them all together. So I'm going to go to payment information 1611, and you'll see the full payment information here. And you can see that all of these different fields are available. I am going to, as I did before, I'm going to change the payment information to cust payment information so that I'm in my own namespace. And the main thing I want to show you here is, so you can see all these different fields that show up. Okay, that's, and we've talked about making fields editable, not editable, visibility-wise by looking at the field definitions themselves. What the other thing that payment information brings to the table is this section up here called Manage UI Rules. So these UI rules interact with the fields on the config UI and allow you to make fields editable, required, what have you. So let's look at bank transfer so you can see what this does. So if I look at bank transfer, again, this is in the same. This is in the business rule context, but these are specialized business rules. You won't see these in your listing for business rules. These are kind of separate and apart, but they work very similarly. So you can see here that it's going to be tied to specific fields on the screen. So in this case, if the payment method is bank transfer, in other words, if this is a bank transfer, i.e., not a check, then if this is not a bank transfer, then we want to hide all the fields that relate to the bank type. If it is a bank, then we want to show all those fields. So in other words, another way to put this would be, if this was a check, then don't show all these fields. I don't need to see account information. I don't need to see account number. I don't need to see routing number, what have you. I only need to see like payee or one or two other fields like that. So that's what these rules do. You can see here it's an if, and then I can set fields to I can set the visibility. I can set required. What have you. So that's what the bank transfer are for. All right. Okay, so that's a little bit about how the rules work. Now let's talk about where do those rules go? How do we put those rules in place? So there's really a couple of places. The first one is if you go back up to the top of the form again, right next to where we store all of our UI rules for the form, right next to that is properties. And so if I click on properties, you can see this is where just the general properties for the config UI are located, but also you can see all of the rules that we have that are tied to the form itself. So these are very similar to what we have if you look at an object or BCUI where we have form level events. This is what's going on here. So you can see all of the things that happen via when it, on an on init. So this when it first comes up, this is all these rules fire, and so all of these ones that have country names on them, these are how the country specific fields pop in. So for example, for America, the account type of checking or savings, that field appears based off of a config UI rule, and one of the places that you're going to put that is under on init UI. So the first time you load it, and then most of these get repeated on an insert UI, on load, what have you. So you can see those are the form level things here. Now, what you don't see here are things that are on save. Because on save, if you think about it, those are data checks, and data checks don't belong on config UI. Config UI is for how we present things. The data checks are done on the config object definitions. So this is just how we lay things out, not how the data itself gets processed. Okay, so that's one place that we put config UI rules. The other place you will see it, and let me find one that actually has one. I believe this one does. If I click on Edit Properties, you can see here, in addition to the things we looked at earlier, where we see the resolver, value type resolver, we also have change UI rules. So in other words, when I make a change to this field, this rule should get triggered. So in this case, there's one change UI for check. So again, that's how it works. So you can have the general form rules, and then you can also have ones that are tied to specific fields, so that you can, for example, when I change the pay type, and I can show, I'll show that real quick. You can see here on change UI rules, when I change the pay type, then the main pay type change UI gets triggered. So, and what this one does is, if it's the main payment type, then amount and percentage fields get hidden. But if it's not the main pay type, then we're going to display the amount and percentage field. So it makes it easier for the user when we do that. Okay, so that is the config UI. That's config UI rules. What I do want to show on this one, though, is if you'll remember on the other one that we looked at, the position, we tie the config UI to the position on object definition. But this one is a little bit different because it's actually two objects melded together. Instead of us maintaining this on this field on this screen, instead what we do is we actually maintain it on the people profile. So if I go to configure people profile, you will see that if I go to payment information, you'll see here, if I click on live profile MDF for payment information, if it'll ever click for me, you can see here right now it's tied to the old config UI. And now I'm going to search for the one I just created. Or actually I didn't, well, you know what, I didn't press save. So never mind, we can't actually assign this to the payment information. But if I had pressed save, then it would have been listed here as one of the config UIs, and I would have been able to select that, and then the payment information would be updated from the old the delivered config UI to our new custom version. So again, that's a quick summary of how config UIs work. Again, it's a way to just present different fields and different functionality than going in just through config UI. It's a nice way for you to be able to adjust the way that the screens look.